And a good morning to everyone on the line. Happy third day of December today. I can't even remember. We're going to give everyone a couple of minutes just to trickle on to the call today and get comfortable with the platform, and then we'll get started. Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. We're still giving folks a few minutes to join. We're a little bit ahead of time, so we'll just give folks a few more minutes to jump on the call and get comfortable with the platform. So to all of our panelists, so yes, everyone will be muted on the call. If you have any questions you'd like to pose to the panel, or if you have any technical problems, just put that in the chat there. We're monitoring the chat box so we can see everything you're saying. And later on, we'll talk a bit about questions and how you can input that during the conversation today. So thanks everyone joining us. We're just gonna give everyone about another minute to join the call. We don't want to take up too much more time, so we'll try to start at 10:35 today. Okay, so it looks like we've got most of our participants with us. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to have so many of you on the call. We've got over 160 classes with us, so that's very exciting. And we're very excited to have you today for this panel discussion on your drug questions answered. So this panel is really about you, the students. We've received a lot of great questions when you registered, a lot of insightful things that you want answered. And so today we've gathered 6 incredible panelists to answer all of the questions that you have submitted today and that you want to have answered. So my name is Chelsea D'Amour. I'm a knowledge broker with the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, and I'm going to be your host and moderator for today's session. So welcome everyone to your drug questions answered. So we're going to begin today with a land acknowledgement. So the panel would like to acknowledge that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships, both historic and modern, with the territories upon which schools and boards are located. Today, these areas are home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, North America. It is on these ancestral, unceded, and treaty lands that we teach, learn, and live. So we would like to give our thanks today that we are able to use this land. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get the event started today. So first off, this event is being recorded. So educators, teachers should have a YouTube link. Once we have this all ready to go, it will be put on YouTube so that you can watch this after, share it with colleagues, friends, or just look back on the event if you missed anything. I'd also like to state at this time that we are going to talk today about some things that might make you uncomfortable or anxious. These may be conversations that you're not used to having. So just if at any time you feel discomfort or anxiety, just let your teacher know and you can, take a few minutes away from the session. We just want to make sure that everyone is comfortable today. Now, as you know, this is really about answering your questions, and we're very excited to see what you have to ask. So in terms of the questions, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, at bottom left-hand corner, there's a Q&A box. And as we talk today, you can feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box, and you can actually see live other questions that are being submitted from other students and other classrooms. And you'll notice that there's a like and an upvote option. So we're encouraging everyone to use those options. If you see a question that you really like, and it's a question that you want answered, go ahead and hit that like or that upvote button so that we know the questions that you're really dying to get answers for. Just to point out, we are probably going to get a lot of questions today. So in the event that we don't get to your question, don't worry too much. We are going to be developing sort of a document after this panel today that will answer the questions that we didn't get to, because we want to make sure that you're getting all of the information that you need. So we're very excited, and our first panelist up today is Sergeant Keith Richards. So Sergeant Richards is the Regional Youth Coordinator for Durham Regional Police Service, where he serves as a liaison between police and the community. So Keith is a 30-year veteran of the Durham Regional Police Service. He's worked throughout the organization, including leading the DPRS Youth and Policing Initiative. Sergeant Richards continues to invest his time in the community by coaching girls and boys freestyle wrestling at local high schools. So welcome, Sergeant Richards. We're very happy to have you today.
Thank you, Chelsea. I'm assuming that you can hear me pretty good. I thought what I'd do is kind of give the audience an idea of, some of the nuances that police experience when we're trying to maintain a safe community. It would be no surprise to anybody that we're kind of living in this uncharted territory of a COVID world, and the experiences that come along with that. I think for all of us, it should be a first-time event. And something that started out in March, and we had school closures throughout the province and so forth. But one of the things that we're always mindful of is that human interaction that some people will miss out on or feel they're missing out on. And it doesn't sound like something that would be a law enforcement scope, but it is something that we have to be aware of. And so it's that whole feeling maybe of isolation. We as humans sometimes need that interaction and conversation and quite honestly just being around each other. And if you're somebody that may be particularly or partially at risk, that might be heightened. I always recommend, keep an eye on your friends, almost like a buddy system. If you're an educator or even a support person or a caregiver, be aware of changes in behavior, outbursts, depression, moods, panic, what have you. For us as advocates for youth, if looking back at it, I would have loved to have had some type of a mechanism where, whether it be a survey or something like that, where you could check in on and almost develop a baseline that everybody is kind of, I'll call it mentally healthy, so to speak, so that as things started maybe progressing into this foreign territory, that we would kind of have an idea that how our young people are doing. For us, we know that some of the mechanisms that people use as a coping strategy can be substance use. Probably the largest one would be alcohol, marijuana, hallucinogens, and ecstasy, and those kind of products that allow people to have what I would almost call a short-term distraction. But it's not a long-term solution. So for us, we're always ever aware of some of the challenges that young people face. And when we get called to assist either community partner or school or something like that, officers do their investigations. A lot of times people think it's a very formal process. It's not always as formal as people would think. Typically, we want to know if there is an offense that's committed. That's obviously important. Is it a first-time offense? And then, what's the young person's feelings around that, whether they're remorseful or so on. If it's not criminal, that's even better, because then it can speed up our remedies. And ultimately, if it does cross that criminal threshold, is there an opportunity for a youth diversion process? Because ultimately, we don't want young people to be in the criminal justice system. We want them to get help. And that's important to us at the end of the day. Probably the only other thing that we're always mindful of is there a victim, and are they being left out? Quite typically, a lot of resources goes into helping the subject, and sometimes there's a victim situation where we just they fall by the wayside. So it's always about making sure that everybody's supported in that process. And, so the officer will go in and do their investigation. And be quite honest with you, and when we go into that scenario, and myself personally is, I sit down, have a conversation with the young person. I usually start the conversation with, how are you feeling? And they're usually caught off guard because they're expecting this more formal approach. But we're talking about human nature and strategies that will help young people. And so for me, it's always about, how are you feeling? Then once we start that part of the process, then we go into the other strategies that I hope will hopefully make that person successful. But it's all about making sure that you check in on your fellow human to ensure that we all have that mental health that we all desire, we all want. So we kind of go through that process, and ultimately it's about trying to develop strategies that will allow everybody to be successful. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sergeant Richard. So I heard you speak a lot about, the steps that you take and what you consider when investigating, an offense at a school, or if drugs may have been brought into a school. So in knowing that, about 60% of young students will try an alcohol or drugs in their life, what are some of the considerations officers make when investigating a drug offense in a school?
Well, we also coordinate with the school, find out what the school's policy is. Is this a first-time offense? Is huge. We understand people make mistakes, young and old. Right? People make mistakes, and or they've exercised bad judgment. And it's not about persecuting somebody for making a mistake. It's about saying, working with the schools. Typically, it's a school. It's not always a school, but working typically with the schools to say, okay, what can we do to fix the situation? It's not about trying to get them in court. It's not about that criminal process. It's about saying, okay, this is the challenge. These are our options, and how can we get them the best help that's possible? Yeah.
So it really just sounds like you're trying to take that, that person first approach, yes, treating them as a human, right? Absolutely. Yeah, and just especially during these COVID times, a lot has changed, right? And, we're changing how we interact and how we learn and how we work, and we're facing a lot of new challenges every day. So what changes have officers had to make when dealing with these types of situations in COVID-19?
So some of the changes are dependent on the circumstances, that instead of going to a school, we might be going to the young person's house because they may be having the classes online. So, which is different for us. And sometimes that can be a little bit of a challenge trying to coordinate with the school, because they may have officials that may or may not be on site. And how do we kind of migrate through that? Obviously, everybody's personal safety is paramount. So we're always aware, okay, is this a situation where we're going to have the young person come out? Who's transporting the young person in their vehicles? All those things in the new COVID world that we never had to consider before, because we'd always go to that point of contact where we were called and deal with it there. And now that it might be off-site, it might be at a group home. And so how do you deal with that whole COVID strategy of trying to keep everybody physically safe, mentally safe, and still come to that hopefully positive conclusion of getting them the help that they need so that they can be successful. So we kind of had to adjust things. And it's a work in progress. It is not a perfected model, because this is an unprecedented time. So we're learning as we go along, but we've had to adjust it because of that.
So it just sounds to me like everyone's really learning, and I think we're trying to do this together. And so I think we just all want to send the message that, we're all in this together, and we're just trying our best to get through these really challenging times.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sergeant Richards. I look forward to sending you some more questions later on in the discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so our next panelist today, we have with us Christopher Cull. So Chris Cull is a filmmaker and founder of Inspired by Example. He is a CCSA board member, and he identifies as someone living in recovery from opioid addiction. In 2015, Chris cycled across Canada from Victoria, BC to St. John's, Newfoundland, raising awareness about prescription drug abuse. He filmed his journey, interviewing local community partners, leaders, patients, and people in recovery along the way. 2 years later, he cycled across Canada a second time to raise awareness about the opioid crisis and show others that recovery is possible. Chris is an internationally recognized public speaker, and we are very excited to have him here with us today. So welcome, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
So yeah, my name is Chris Cole. I'm 36. My birthday yesterday, actually, just crossed over, and I'm from Oshawa. And yeah, so I'm in recovery from opioid addiction, and just to elaborate or expand on that a little bit, I spent about 2 years there using. Started out with using Percocet, which led to using OxyContin, to which at its peak, I was using roughly about 580 milligram OxyContins a day. And that was over a 2 year span. And I lost everything that meant anything to me to it. Um, and then I realized how I needed to kind of make some change, and went into, I tried going cold turkey off of it twice, and it just wasn't able to do it. And then I went on to a harm reduction program, which was methadone. And I spent 5 years on 5 years on methadone before I was thankfully able to taper off and get off. And then saw so much in that 7 years of experience that made me curious to see what it was like across the rest of the country, and to see if it was as bad as it is everywhere else as it was from what I saw. And so yeah, part of it all was yeah, filming my journey, and then documenting all these stories from town to town, coast to coast, literally from the Pacific to the Atlantic. And part of it all was going out and doing all this crazy stuff I dreamt of doing that I couldn't do when I couldn't travel. So I hammered a bucket of golf balls off the mountains in BC, jumped out of an airplane over Montreal, whitewater rafted Northern Ontario, etc. And then yeah, so I just wanted to use my experience to try to, I don't know, then pay it forward, and hopefully show people that you can come back from the worst of circumstances. But thank you guys for having me today. And I just want to say that if there's whatever questions you have, there's nothing offside with me. If I'm not being fully honest with my experience, then I'm doing a disservice to you guys. So anything you within reason, I suppose, just please feel free to ask, and I'm more than happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Chris. And again, we're so excited to have you here and hear about your experience. And so thank you for sharing that with us. You know, you're living in recovery now, but, you know, a lot of folks always wonder, you know, what caused you to start using opioids and drugs? And then subsequently, what motivated you to stop using them?
So when I was 17, my dad, he was diagnosed with Huntington's disease. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a neurodegenerative disease, and your brain starts slowly shutting down on itself. And he was a paramedic for 27 years. I mean, he was my hero, and he was the only parent I really had around. And he lost his job. He lost his driver's license. He started drinking very heavily to kind of cope with that. And that mixed with the Huntington's. I mean, there was days where I'd come home, and he was either drinking heavily enough that he didn't know who I was and thought I was breaking in. And other days I would come home, and he had tried to take his own life several times, and on some occasions asked me to help him. And I was living on a knife's edge with stress every day. And I just didn't know on any given day if I was going to come home to the worst day of my life. And so that was, over time, I just couldn't handle it. I just didn't know how to handle it. And I started using Percocet to just numb myself out enough to try to keep pushing forward. I was in school at the time, excuse me, at Durham College. And that spiraled out of control very quickly, because there's, once you're addicted to opioids, there's just never enough. And so that's what led to OxyContin, and then that transition. But as far as what caused me to go the other way and say, okay, I can't do this anymore, was I was still the latter 2 years of my of being on methadone. I was stealing my food to eat. I went down to 139 pounds and was going up to 4 days without eating for different little stretches. And I went 2 years without gas in my home, where I had to curtain off my living room and use electric heaters just to stay warm. And it was a nightmare. And one day I was actually working my job as a cashier at a very well-known department store. And a guy came through my line and with his groceries, and he had these 3 apples at the end. And he, long story short, I put in the numbers, and he told me it was the wrong price. went back to the department, grabbed the sign off the hard plastic sign, and he came back and frisbeed it square into my nose, cut my nose open to say 50 cents on 3 apples. And that was just, I went home, I quit my job that day, and I went home, and I'm just like, I can't live like this anymore. I'm just tired of surviving. And I knew that if I kept going the way I was going to die soon. And that was a very real, life and death were two very real coexisting possibilities. And I'm just like, well, I can't go out not doing all this stuff that I always wanted to do. So I created my own system to figure out what it was I wanted to do with myself, where I wrote down these 4 boxes of my passions, interests, hobbies, and stuff I knew I didn't, or I hated, just to know what to cancel out. And the ride, the film, so forth was the loose culmination of those results. But I mean, it was just I tried getting off methadone a couple times, and I just wasn't able to. And it wasn't until I set a bigger goal up that to do after I'd got off methadone, where it just turned getting off of it into a smaller step to something bigger. And that's how I started navigating it. It took me 1.5 years to taper off of opioids, which was a long stretch. And I got off January 27th of 2015, or sorry, I did the ride in 2014 rather. So I got off January 27th, 2014, was on the road riding and filming in May of 2014. So it was my biggest thing was that you got to create a life that you don't want to escape from. And once I kind of had that, and I had my direction, and I knew I didn't know if I was going to succeed or fail, but I knew I was going to love what I was going to be doing. So that was enough for me to be like, okay, it just gave me the final push to do it, which thankfully survived the ride and made it. So.
Well, that's great, Chris. And I've heard your story a couple times, and I'm always so inspired just to hear the details. And, I think this really sheds light on the fact that, substance use and addiction is a very complicated thing. It's different for everyone, and folks go through different experiences, different stressors, different traumas in their life that might end up impacting you in ways that it did with you. So thank you for sharing that with us. So one of the questions that we wanted to ask was, going back to our stats from before, we know that about 62% of Canadian students have tried alcohol or cannabis. From your lived experience, what would be the best way to prevent young people from sort of crossing that line into problematic use?
It's a complicated question or answer rather. I mean, I smoked marijuana or weed for my first time when I think I was 15, drank for my first time when I was 15, 16. And I think that, I think it's natural to have that curiosity to explore it. And the key to it is making sure it doesn't get out of hand. And it goes back to what led me to get off of opioids in the first place is the best answer I can give. And it's creating a life for yourself that you don't want to escape from, and that you're passionate about. You're getting up in the morning enjoying what you're going to be doing. And I mean, I think, well, at least in my life, it's the key is to I try to wake up wanting to do things rather than having to do things. And I've tried to design my life in such a way that I'm able to do that. But I mean, I think the key to it all is finding out what you're passionate about, which is a very difficult thing to find. But I mean, to simplify it down to how to figure out what that is for you is like when I come into schools and do speeches, I ask them questions. Like if you ask any kid what their goal is, they're like, I don't know. But like if you ask them in a way that's engaging to them, like, what would you be doing with your life if you weren't getting paid to do it? And you could just do anything you want and just do whatever you want with your life. Because I don't care what it is, there's some way out there to make a living from it. And I mean, I know guys who make over $100,000 a year playing video games, for crying out loud. So, I mean, but it's finding out what you're passionate about. Or like, if you want to ask another engaging way to stimulate someone's imagination, it's like, okay, well, if you were amazing and your life were amazing, what would amazing look like to you? And then that will the gears will start turning. But I mean, it's just simply knowing about who you are, what you enjoy doing. Your interests are going to change over time, but it's like, what do you do in your spare time when you're not getting paid or don't have to be doing it? And then you start there, and then write down what these things are for you, and then start looking towards ways that you might be able to do something with it. Because when I started out, I had no experience in film journalism as far as interviewing people, public speaking, public relations. I hadn't rode a bike in 8 years, and I was just getting out of my 7-8 year opioid addiction. So even my mom tried to talk me out of it, but I mean, find what your passion is, and I promise you, you'll never really work a day in your life, because you'll usually just be getting up, getting after it, and enjoying everything you're doing. And I think that's just the best way to kind of keep on the straight and narrow, is that you're focused on something you really love doing.
Yeah. I think we have a saying in the addiction field. It's when you're in recovery, you're not just surviving, you're thriving. And we want to help people thrive in their life, not just survive their day to day. And I think that's what you're getting at, is finding the passion and finding something you're really happy and excited about. And that will guide you and motivate you through your life, if you can find that thing for yourself. I have one more question, Chris. When we're talking about, you were able to, get on methadone. How did you get that help? What was the process of you accessing those services and getting that help for yourself?
So I went to methadone more so because I didn't know what other options there were. Like I said, I tried doing the cold turkey route a couple times, and it just, that was hell. That was awful. And so through the people I had actually was using with, we knew in the circles what methadone was, but none of us had ever went there. And then finally, I'm like, well, if this is my way out, then hey, go explore it. So I went into the clinic really apprehensively, and spoke with the intake, and they would go through your list of questions of what drugs you use, and go through the criteria to make sure you are actually addicted to opioids and physically dependent on them. And then you go and you do some blood work and some ECGs for your heart, just to make sure that you can get onto it. And then you start the process. You start at a dose of about 30 milligrams. And what what methadone does is it has a longer what's called half-life than say OxyContin, which is what I was taking. So instead of me taking a pill and it lasting about 3/4 of my day before I'd need more, this will last me a straight 24 hours, so that I could kind of so I could function and just kind of get through my day to day without the fear of going into withdrawal, because that fear drives a lot of your behaviors when you're addicted to opioids and physically dependent on them. And that when you take away that fear of withdrawing from them, then then you can start focusing on getting your life, getting at least some kind of direction to start improving it. And it takes time, and it's very difficult, but I don't know, my sharing my experience, I just wanted to show it was possible. So.
Well, Chris, I definitely think it's possible. And I think that's the message we want to send today. And we hope we can we'll share more questions with you later. And thanks again for sharing your story.
No, thank you.
Okay, so up next, our next panelist is Jonathan Jack. So Jonathan is an addiction counselor who has worked for Pinewood Center of Lakeridge Health for over 5 years. Jonathan provides care to people who use drugs and alcohol. He is currently part of the youth outreach team, offering therapy, case management, and advocacy for youth to move towards their identified goals, as well as community outreach, providing education to reduce stigma and promote a holistic harm reduction approach to treatment for mental health and substance-related concerns. So Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So Jonathan, how, in your role in working as an addiction counselor, how do you support those who would like to make a change? So if Chris were to come to you today as a young person and say, I am struggling with my opioid addiction, I really want to start to make a change in my life, I'm motivated, how can I do that?
Right. So I think the first part of this is to kind of define what counseling actually looks like. So a lot of people think, what they see in the movies or TV shows where someone's laying down and the counselor's just asking you, okay, now how does that make you feel? That's not exactly what it looks like. It's more conversational. It's more based on the goals of that person that's coming in and meeting with myself. So if Chris were to come in, the first thing we would do is just talk about what his goals were. Why is he here in the first place? Is this, is this something he's wanting to stop completely? Is he wanting to make some changes just to reduce the amount of harm? And then from there, we build a plan moving forward. So the main thing to know is that we want to work collaboratively with our clients to so that they feel that they kind of have a say in what their treatment looks like, and they are kind of the experts in their own of themselves. So we really want their input to kind of drive where sessions go. And then from there, part of my role is it's not just about the therapeutic aspect, it's also advocating or making referrals into certain programs that also might be helpful for those clients, and then and really trying to look at the biological, psychological, and social aspects of our lives, and trying to approach it keeping all of those things in mind.
So it sounds really like you're really just trying to meet that person where they're at and meet their needs. And I think that's great, because oftentimes we hear conversations, I think people assume that it's a lot like, tell me what your feelings are, or tell me how your mother treated you when you were young. And that's so much different than how we approach a lot of these things today. So,
That's right.
Jonathan, in your role, we hear a lot in the news right now about harm reduction, especially as it relates to the opioid crisis. We know that the pandemic has really kind of dampened some of our efforts to help people, and that has increased some opioid overdose and some deaths. So can you explain to us, what is harm reduction? What does that term mean?
So harm reduction is any practice that we can put in place to reduce the harm of any given behavior. So, for example, right now, I guess like washing our hands is an example of harm reduction, or wearing one of these. It's not a foolproof method in order to eliminate harm, but it is something that we can do to reduce the chance or the amount of harm that we might cause ourselves. So in the substance use world, harm reduction, it might look like, for example, Chris going on methadone, which was a more effective opioid that he can continue to function and continue to work on what he needed to get to where he wanted to be. It might look like just reducing the amount of use, or changing up kind of the pattern of use so that it's causing less harm in our lives. And harm can be to us physically, but it can also be in our relationships, or psychologically. And so we want to look, when we're talking about harm reduction, we're looking at a person as a whole, and any way in which we can reduce that harm, we want to promote that. And it's kind of the philosophy that we follow when it comes to substance use, and how any movement towards reducing harm is a positive movement, and we want to encourage that.
So I'm just going to throw this question at you, because this is one I get a lot working in the harm reduction space. What would you tell someone, a parent, a young person? Harm reduction is just encouraging young people to use drugs.
So I do hear that quite often. I think the main thing with that is that we have to understand that young people are curious about substance use, and that if we're not providing proper education about safe use, then we are actually promoting more harmful behaviors. If we already know that there's going to be certain young people who decide that they want to test out their curiosity or try certain substances, well, let's make that as safe as possible for that person. Let's try and reduce the amount of harm, because we can't just expect young people to try and kind of lock them up and not have any chances of running into a situation like that. So I think it's more important that they have the proper education, so that if they do decide that they're going to use, that they can do so in a safe manner, and in a manner that's going to hopefully reduce any harm to come to them.
That's great. And I think this just makes sense, right? We know that, as I said before, about 62% of students between grade 7 and grade 12 are going to try alcohol or drugs. So it's important that we be realistic about this, like you're saying, but we help support in a safer way. Well, that's great. Thank you so much, John, and I look forward to sending some more questions your way later on.
Thank you very much.
Great. Okay, next up we have Alana Burke. She's going to be our fourth panelist today. So Alana is the Client Care Manager with the Mental Health and Pinewood Center of Lakeridge Health for Community Treatment Team. Her team provides support related to substance use, gambling, gaming, and technology use for youth, adults, and their family members. Alana has experience providing supervision to teams in both children's mental health and community health settings in Toronto and the Durham region. In these settings, she has supported the implementation of walk-in models of care, youth hubs, urban telepsychiatry, and partnerships between hospital and community-based programs. Alana is very excited to be here today. We are equally as excited to have her here for the conversation. So welcome, Alana. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So Alana, as John just said, and I think this is such a perfect segue, we know that young people are curious, even about drugs. Why is it important that young people have the opportunity to ask questions when they learn about substance use? And what can make this challenging? What might prevent a young person from feeling like they can ask questions?
Well, we definitely know that having opportunities to learn more about mental health and substance use provide you with a stronger ability to have informed decisions. We know that you may have had negative past experiences in talking about substance use. Maybe you've been told what to do, what not to do, or have been fearful of asking some really important questions. Stigma still does exist, and although we're doing a lot of work to reduce stigma, there are a variety of opinions, right, and judgments related to substance use, and also when it becomes problematic. So mental health and substance use are connected to one another. And there can be direct impacts on your brain and its development, how you experience your emotions, and as well as how you think. If you are having challenges with any mental health concerns, substances, gaming, gambling, technology use, together or separately, can provide you with a temporary relief or distraction with everything that you may be coping with, especially during the pandemic. So everything interacts with one another, and this can have an impact on your relationships with those who are most important to you, like your family, your friends, and your ability to work in school and focus, and your overall health and well-being is most important. So having a forum like this to ask your questions in a way that you won't feel judged and feel heard is extremely important.
Great, thank you, Alana. And this is the perfect time to remind everyone to keep those questions coming. Use the like and the upvote buttons if there's any questions you really want to get answered, and we're going to do our best to get to those today. So actually, Alana, I want to ask a question from the audience. So if you had a friend who was struggling with substance use and they didn't know how to stop, how could you help them get support?
Listening is a really great first step. And sometimes we don't know where the conversation will go. But I think it's a tremendous strength of a friend. If they're reaching out to you, it says to me that they trust you. And definitely in that trusting relationship, you want to listen to them, hear what their thoughts are, but also notice if you're becoming worried about them and knowing who you can trust to reach out if they need further support. So definitely an area that is complicated and might feel uncomfortable, but you do want to go to those who you trust first and be able to share what you're thinking and your thoughts, and then go to a trusted adult as available to you to see where can you learn more. Access to the internet is for everyone right now, and you may not always have the most up-to-date information or the most accurate information. So a forum like this, I'm hopeful that it'll give a really great foundation to start asking some more questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alana. We really appreciate that, and hopefully we can send a few more questions your way as we continue with the panel. So up next, we have Dr. Dalia Rosen. So Dr. Rosen is a regional physician leader at CATC, providing leadership and guidance to our addiction doctors and clinics. She has been working as a physician since 1997 and joined the CATC in 2011 to focus on addiction medicine. She currently provides medication-assisted treatment, methadone and Suboxone, for patients across Ontario who are addicted to opioids, committed to helping them get well and get back to life drug-free. She has a number of specialty interests, including substance use during pregnancy and chronic pain management. So thank you, Dalia. It's really great to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
So we know that drug and alcohol use comes with a whole host of different possible risks and harms to the body and the brain. If we know that drugs are not good for our physical and mental health, why do people do drugs? Or why do we make drugs? I think that question came up a couple times. Why are drugs even around? Why do they exist?
So I think that's a great question. So we know that pain medication is a drug that's prescribed by physicians, and when taken properly can be very helpful for people who've had surgery or who have a broken arm. But at the same time, those same painkillers, if you take them, like Chris was saying, and you continue to take them, they can go from just being something that you're taking once or twice for fun, or maybe let's say you're bored and you just want to see what it's like, and then it can just spiral and get to be something that you're addicted to.
Great. So we have another student question for you here, Dr. Rosen. Why do so many people use drugs to help deal with pain? Why is that how we manage pain?
Well, there are other ways to deal with pain. When you say pain, I assume you mean physical pain. So when someone's actually hurting, there are other ways, but sometimes, when pain is very severe, it really is what works well. So like the examples that I said with, if you have surgery or you break something, you're in a lot of pain, pain medication will work quickly. But if you have psychological pain, like you're sad or you're depressed or nervous, you may take a pain medication just because it will help you temporarily, but really what you should be doing is probably speaking to someone and trying to deal with that type of pain in a different way.
So it sounds a lot like when we heard in the beginning of the conversation that we have to kind of address the aspects of everyone's life as a whole, right? It's not just one piecemealed approach. We have to talk about all of those things together.
Exactly. When you say pain, I think we need to understand, what kind of pain is someone dealing with to try to help them in the best way.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Rosen, and I look forward to throwing some more questions your way at the end here.
Thank you.
All right, we're on to our last panelist. So our last panelist today is Leisha DiGiacchino. Leisha is a knowledge broker with myself at the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction. Leisha believes her research helps send a message that recovery is possible. So very similar to Chris's message today. Her passion for work comes from personal experience with the cycle of intergenerational substance use. Leisha is passionate about using research that promotes women's well-being, including the prevention of drug use during pregnancy. In her free time, Leisha volunteers with the Community Addiction Peer Support Association, helping people with substance use disorder access the support they need when seeking help without fear of stigma or discrimination. So welcome, Leisha. It's so great to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Chelsea, and thank you everyone for having me. I'll begin by acknowledging the unceded Algonquin territory that I'm joining you from. As Chelsea mentioned, I work at CCSA and we do research on drugs and we share that research. So I've been doing that for about 10 years and I studied it for a few years too. I am a person with a substance use disorder, which is the medical term for addiction, the diagnostic term. And through studying and working on addiction research and through receiving treatment for my substance use disorder, I learned that we have tools in a toolkit to deal with things like stress and sadness. And when I was your age, my tool was drug use. So in combination with my parents both having substance use disorders and me starting to take drugs to cope with stress and sadness while my brain was developing, which ends at around age 26, by the way, those combination of factors led me to develop a substance use disorder. So I'm sharing this with you today because I want to empower you with tools in your toolbox, because we all get sad and we all get stressed. And unfortunately, trauma comes in life. And so for me personally, I love to run. I love to eat and make good, delicious food. I like to write poetry. And I use these tools when I'm experiencing sadness anxiety, an emotion I feel the need to cope with. And what I've learned is that our emotions actually don't last too long. So I can even go for a 15-minute run and move beyond that. Through years of doing this, I'm living well with a substance use disorder. But it's harder to do when your brain's developed and you have to now treat a substance use disorder. Before your brain is developed and before a substance use disorder has been developed, the more these tools are used, like running, or perhaps for you, you like to listen to music, maybe you like to make music, maybe you like to engage in a physical activity, you're into sports, whatever those tools are for you. Maybe I'll give a couple more because I think it's important. I'm seeing the questions people are asking about the development of substance use disorder. So we can make a list of all the people in our network, right? All the people we love and care about, people that have been there for us. Maybe we can even write little notes of what they've done so we know that we can turn to them when we're feeling an emotion, that we can trust them. And we can be that person to others. I saw a couple questions about what we can do to support friends that are using drugs. And while your brain is developing, we have these reward pathways that are forming. So the more you go for that run or you get a really great night's sleep to deal with your anxiety, the more your brain, when you're older and it's developed, will go to those tools. When we turn to drug use to cope with these emotions, our reward pathway develops in a way that we turn to drugs when to deal with negative emotions rather, almost without thinking about it, or thinking very little about it. So I wanted to share that with you and empower you to figure out what those are for yourself. There is a couple questions about what steps to take during treatment. So I had an opioid use disorder and my withdrawal symptoms were too difficult to manage. So I wasn't able to do so with complete abstinence. So I actually started at an addiction clinic, which was at the university I was going to. Through there, I was told to sign up for a local here in Ottawa. It's called Rita Wood Treatment Center. I was told to fill out an intake form, which I did. And then eventually I was brought in there, which I actually still to this day receive outpatient treatment to maintain the good life that I live now without using drugs. So I went from there and I do continue to see an addiction physician. So there is the ability to manage symptoms with medications if necessary, but I receive more psychosocial support, so counseling. I wanted to clarify, I have this in my notes here, when Sergeant Richards was talking about coping strategies, that's really what I'm talking about here, this toolkit. So thank you. And as Chris mentioned, of course, if you have questions, please ask anything you want. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leisha. So I actually did have a student question for you. The student had asked, how did you start feeling when you first started taking drugs? How did that make you feel?
It was two ways. I was upset with myself because I always told myself I wouldn't do drugs because I saw so much of it in the home. I saw so much pain. I saw so many harms that experienced by my family from drugs. So I always said I would never touch a drug. So I was upset with myself. I didn't understand substance use disorder then. So it's not reasonable. It was not reasonable for me to be upset with myself at that time. It was very understandable why I was turning to drugs. But it was an effective tool at the time. One of the things they say in treatment is drugs work until they stop working. So sure, my anxiety, my sadness, my stress was numbed at the time. But to be honest with you, the harms I experienced from a substance use disorder were worse than the original sadness and stress that I had been using drugs to cope with. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you so much, Leisha. I appreciate that. So now that the panel's over, we're going to switch gears now to the open Q&A session. So I'd like to move to our top voted question right now. And I'm actually going to put this out to the whole panel to see if anyone would want to answer this question. So can you elaborate on what opioids are in comparison to marijuana? Or relatedly, how does the use of medical cannabis and other prescription drugs impact teens? So would anyone want to take on that question? What's the difference between opioids and cannabis? What do we need to think about?
So I can take that. So Opioids are anything that's related to the poppy. So if you think of the poppy seed, that gets turned into different painkillers like morphine. Maybe you've heard of heroin or fentanyl. These are all medications that can be prescribed to patients who are in pain, like we talked about before, but they can also be very addictive if taken by people who don't have pain, and very different from marijuana. So completely just two separate drugs. A lot of people think that marijuana is like a gateway drug to using opiates, that if you start taking it, then things will lead to opiate use, and very different treatments. So, not everybody that's using or smoking marijuana will necessarily get addicted. It may affect them, but they won't need to necessarily be treated in the same way that someone addicted to opiates or pain pills will be. And Chris talked about methadone, and that is definitely a way to help people who are addicted to opiates, but we do have other options. So sometimes counseling is helpful. We also use something called Suboxone, which is usually not taken for as many years as Chris mentioned, and also very helpful for young people, especially teenagers who may be struggling with opiate addiction.
Thank you, Dr. Rosen. That was very insightful, and I hope that that clarified for our students some of the differences between those two classes of drugs. So maybe this question can go to either Leisha or Chris. What do you experience during withdrawal? And I guess this would be specific to opiate withdrawal in this case, but what does that feel like? What is that experience like?
For me, well, I guess for both of us, but I mean, yeah, it's everything from cold sweats to hot flashes to restlessness to irritability. You literally lay there in bed and minutes feel like hours. You're just sweating and you're freezing, and then yeah, it's just I found that the mental aspect of it within the addiction part, like your mind is just all over the place. Like I mean, you're very sensitive. You're crying when you're thinking about just that because you don't feel like this is ever going to end and that you're never going to escape this. And the pain of the moment is just overwhelming. This isn't a technical description of it, but it's awful. I don't really know how to elaborate on it kind of much from there. I think Alicia could probably take it over.
Yeah, well, so he mentioned it. It's flu-like symptoms, basically. The cold sweats. I had no tolerance for pain for a while. Even a bed sheet was painful to my skin. Very nauseous. We have receptors, right? We have opioid receptors in our body, and we have a lot in our gut. So lots of stomach, just sickness, flu-like symptoms. But the depression and anxiety was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. And you think you're gonna die, you won't, but you think you're not gonna make it. It's really affects your mental health. But what's a struggle is a lot of people with substance use disorder, opioid disorder, have what's called comorbid. So at the same time, have other mental disorders like depression, like anxiety, like for me, post-traumatic stress disorder. So those disorders were also coming into play. And you are also dealing with the reality of your life, what your life has come to, what all that has happened. And usually it can be traumatic, like a bunch of traumatic stuff happens when you're actively in use and have an opioid use disorder. Yeah, I think that covers it. Basically, you have the flu, and it gets a little better, but it takes about 10 days of being very, very sick. I thank you for this question, because it's important to know that when we take, well, now it's probably more like Dilaudid that you would get prescribed for wisdom teeth or whatever. Sometimes even just taking your prescribed dose, you can start to feel withdrawal symptoms, right? And that's why it's important to kind of notice these things and be aware, right? While you're taking them, you can ask your doctor what you can experience and really try to, it's not like antibiotics, like take the whole thing, like really try to not take as much if you can to deal with the pain.
Right. So it's just, you have to listen to your body and just, it's very important, and, talk to a pharmacist when you're starting new medications. Make sure that you're reading the labels and you understand what the medications are, because this can be a serious thing. If these are new medications for people, you're not aware of what the effects will be. It's just important to be safe and make sure you know about these things. And all the more reason why we have these conversations, so that we can open up the discussions and that we have more kind of transparency with each other. So that's great. I want to put this question, I think maybe either probably to Dr. Rosen. So one of our students wanted to know, what do some of our harder drugs, and I think by that they mean opioids, what do they do to your brain and your body? So, or even in an addiction with another substance, what kinds of changes can happen?
So when you take drugs, especially opiates, for example, they kind of hijack your brain. They kind of change the way that your brain thinks and the way that you function, and it can take over and lead you on a different path than you were probably going to be on. And so there's different concerns. There's short-term concerns if you just take something a couple of times, and then there's longer term concerns. So in the worst case scenario, like Chris and Leisha have talked about, you can get addicted. It can really take over your whole life. It can affect your ability to go to school, your ability to work. You kind of lose things that you love and that are important to you. And unfortunately, in the worst case scenario, people do overdose and, God forbid, even die. And unfortunately, these days, just trying something once, let's say marijuana or a pill, where you think, oh, okay, I'm just going to take it once just to see what it is. Probably nothing bad's going to happen to me. That used to be the case, but unfortunately, what we're seeing now is we're seeing very, very strong drugs just mixed in, even something like into marijuana. So I don't know if you've heard of fentanyl, but it's a very, very, very strong painkiller that really only should be used when someone is going to sleep during surgery. But unfortunately, it has become a very popular street drug. And we have seen in some instances where someone thought they were just smoking some marijuana, some weed, and there was fentanyl in there. We don't know how it got there. We don't know why it got there, but unfortunately, very serious things can come if someone's not used to taking a very powerful opiate like fentanyl, and people can overdose and even die. So very, very serious outcomes, unfortunately.
Yes, very. Well, thank you, Dr. Rosen. We appreciate your response. So we have a question here, and I'll throw this out to the whole panel. What is the most addictive drug in Canada? Some of our students want to know that. Do we know what the most addictive drug in Canada is?
Fentanyl.
Fentanyl. What does our panel think? Are we in agreement with that?
Yeah, at this stage in the game, yeah, I'd agree with that.
So that would be one of our opioid-based substances then. And then again, Chris, sorry, go ahead, John.
Sorry, I was just going to add to that. I think it's hard to definitively say. I think with the emergence of fentanyl, the tolerance is built so much quicker for people who are using it, and then the corresponding withdrawal effects are that much harder to get through. So that being said, though, I think it just depends on the person. That someone might try something like fentanyl and never want to try it again, but might try another substance, and that becomes more of a concern for them. So I think, although I think fentanyl is definitely kind of the one that's out there the most right now, I do think it is dependent on the person themselves. And I don't really know if there's statistics to say. I know there's statistics about how many like youth have used substances, but actually how many would define that as being a substance use problem or concern. I'm not sure if there's actual data on that.
Yeah, sorry to follow that up too. I think alcohol is easily the most widely used substance out there that people have a high addiction to. But fentanyl, yeah, its emergence in the last X amount of years has been really troubling. But I think alcohol is easily the most widely used substance as far as addictive substances.
I think part of the challenge is, while fentanyl is very addictive, something to be considered though is the danger factor in using it. alcohol, you can build up this tolerance, or you can have a prolonged approach to taking it. Whereas fentanyl is something that if you're not careful or not aware of what you're even being involved in, can be detrimental almost instantly to you. So, I think that while we're asking about what might be the most addictive, for sure, fentanyl will be at the top of the list for the most dangerous, regardless of the addiction.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sergeant Richards.
I-
This is a tough, sorry,
sorry.
I'm just, go ahead, Doctor.
I was just going
Okay,
to talk
this
about
is-
cigarettes. Cigarettes are something that we don't necessarily think of as a drug, but highly addictive. And I think that, kids in grade 7 and 8 need to think about cigarettes as being something that they can become addicted to. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just thought that was important.
And vaping, right? We know vaping is something that's it has gained a lot of popularity in the recent years, and that has its own risks as well, right? All substances are not without risk. It's just, a lot of these conversations are, how do we help people use them in a safer way? So this is kind of a tough question, but I think it's an important question to ask. And I think this is going to be directed more towards our counselors on the panel. So when someone really wants to die, what do you do? How do you support someone who's really, really struggling and who maybe is expressing that motivation to live isn't there? How do you help them?
I think the first step with that is to validate how they're feeling. That this isn't, this doesn't make them less than or weird for feeling this way. That lots of people do get those feelings from time to time, and really just trying to understand what it is that's causing them to feel that way, but then also talk about the hopes that they might have or the goals that they might have. And I think anytime someone reaches out to me saying that they're feeling that way, one of the questions I always ask is, well, what made you call me? And that there had to have been some kind of hope there and some kind of, goal that maybe this might help in some way. And so from that point, hopefully we can get to a place where we can have a discussion about, creating a safety plan and making sure that there's lots and lots of support around that person and that, regardless of the time of day or anything, that there will always be someone that they can reach out to if they needed to talk about what's going on. And sometimes it does mean, that we end up contacting more emergency services, and maybe that might look like them ending up being admitted to a hospital or something for a little while things can kind of get sorted out.
Great.
I agree with John, and I think that resilience plays a huge role for everyone, especially during this pandemic. Your regular life is not what it used to be, and how you've spent your time looks different, and you've had to be creative, and things that used to bring you joy, you may not have access to do. And especially as we're all moving through the public health measures, I think to Leisha's point around, there's a difference between surviving versus thriving. And those are the conversations we want to have, is what is important to you in your life? To Chris's point, what is really important to you? What are your aspirations? What are your hopes? And you may not be seeing that at that moment of time. And our emotions do change, our life does change. And so it's our responsibility to be able to have those conversations with you to learn about what is most important and where can we begin. We can't do everything overnight, but definitely one step at a time in building some really important changes to help you live the life that you deserve.
Absolutely. And in keeping with that line of conversation, Alana, what do you do if you have a friend and you're concerned they use drugs, but they are not expressing that they want to stop? So this is something that they're still actively engaged in, and you want to help them, but maybe they're a bit resistant to your support.
Well, we use this model called stage of change. And what that means is we recognize that everyone's at a different place in their conversation around whether it's substance use, gaming, gambling, technology use. There's a spectrum. And so it's our responsibility and to really have conversations so that people want to have another conversation. Engagement is so important. So if it's your family member, if it's your friend, if someone's approaching you and wanting to talk, be there, as John's pointed out, validate, listen, understand more before giving solutions or recommendations so that it's not a miss. And then once you learn really where that person's at, they may progress and change over time, or they may remain where they are. And so reducing harm at whatever level someone's involved in is really important.
So again, it sounds like we're meeting them where they're at, right? It's about where they want to take their recovery journey and what is best for them at that point in their life. So do you have any strategies for how a young person, a student, could say no if they were offered drugs at a party without feeling uncomfortable? We know that sometimes we can be put in these situations, we feel pressured. Do you have any tips for students who would like to say no in these situations? And this can go to the whole panel if anyone feels comfortable answering to this.
Well, at least for me, as far as like being in any uncomfortable situations, I've been in a few over the since I've been in recovery. And I mean, the way I, like I was saying earlier, design my life is I just stack my schedule with things I want to be doing. So I mean, it's now it's just as easy as saying, okay, well, I got to work in the morning, no, I can't, or I'm okay. It's just I don't let anybody kind of make me. I've had a couple people try to make me feel really uncomfortable about it, but that's when I start actually kind of getting a little bit more angry towards that person for pushing the issue rather than just listening to me in the first place. Chances are, if you're sitting there trying to push me to get to that point, then you're not somebody I should really be around in the first place, which will give me a bigger lesson in all that I don't really want to be around you anymore. But as far as like a general kind of in a party atmosphere and someone asks you if you want this or that, it's just like no. It's just most people would just back off as soon as say, no, I'm good, thanks. But I also understand there is that other factor there of people actually pressuring you to do it, and in which case that should be a red flag and say, okay, I don't think this is someone I should be around.
And I think generally speaking, a lot of young people have a sense that a lot of their peers use substances, but there are a lot of young people who don't. And so maybe it's about bringing up the conversation and talking more openly about, not using drugs and why that's okay too. So I have a couple questions just to bring it back to our COVID context. So we know that stress and anxiety has increased during the pandemic, and there's a lot that has changed in people's lives. Do drugs kind of help alleviate that stress and anxiety? Do people turn to alcohol and drugs to help them with this? And this again could go to anyone on the panel.
I can take a shot at that. I think one of the things that has not really been discussed a lot in the past and is now becoming more of a discussion is just the acknowledgement that drugs are effective in what they do for people. And it doesn't just have to be drugs. It can be any kind of behavior that gives us some sense of comfort, eases our anxiety, makes us feel happier or better about ourselves. And I think that it makes sense a lot of the times for people, especially during a time like we're in right now, to search out things that are making us feel better. And so first we have to acknowledge that, but then also acknowledge the fact that, are they really an effective way to solve how we're feeling? Or is this just kind of more of a Band-Aid solution that we're giving ourselves? I'm feeling bored, so I can just use something and then I won't feel bored anymore. But then when that wears off, I'm feeling bored again. Instead of, trying to find something to do to take up our time so we don't feel bored. So, I think it's important to point out that this doesn't just have to be about drugs, that it could be eating or shopping or gaming or gambling or any kind of behavior that makes us feel good. Although, in something like eating, we need to eat, but that can become problematic if we're using it for other purposes other than just nourishing our bodies. And I think that kind of goes across the board with substance use and any behavior.
Absolutely. It's that old adage, moderation is key, right?
Right.
Okay, well, we are closing in on our last few minutes. Now, there is something I want to talk about before we leave the conversation, and this is around the Good Samaritan Act. And maybe Sergeant Richards could speak to this very quickly before we close off for the day, because as we are seeing throughout COVID more overdoses, opioid overdoses happen, I think it's important that young students know about the Good Samaritan Act. So Keith, would you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so basically the Good Samaritan Act is basically it's legislation and also basically into criminal law, where if you are trying to, whether it be you're trying to advocate or get involved in a circumstance where somebody might get hurt as a result of your actions, or there might be some type of a criminal overlay as a result of your actions, that you aren't liable for it. Basically what they're trying to say is, if you get involved where the intent is to help, you by virtue of your actions aren't going to be responsible, criminal responsible, or even liable. For us in policing, it's a very big piece of legislation because we spend a lot of our time interjecting into people's lives that may or may not want us present, even though our end goal is community safety. And so, you have to have things in case law in order to protect people who get involved. So maybe it might be a scenario where somebody has overdosed, and so maybe you don't know CPR, but you recognize that they're not breathing, and so you start trying to do CPR with whatever you've seen on TV. Maybe you're trying to pull up on your phone, and so now you're trying to do the CPR, but really you're not doing it correctly, and maybe as a result that person ends up in worse shape. You won't be responsible if you're acting in good faith to try and help somebody else. And that's kind of what it's all meant around, is that if you're acting in good faith to help somebody, you won't be responsible. So it's, in Canadian society, we would prefer that you try than to say, oh, geez, if I do the wrong thing, bad things can happen. Well, no, bad things aren't going to happen if the intent was to try and help somebody. So think of it that way, is that when in doubt, always try to get involved. There's different levels of involvement. So for some, their big stretch might be that they've actually went and called for help, whereas other people will say, I wouldn't have even done that. So great, okay, that's a good starting point. Call for help. For other people, it might be, I'm going to try my best to offer medical assistance until maybe the ambulance, paramedics, police, or fire show up. And for others, it might be, you know what? We're in a wooded area and we've got to carry this person out to a place of safety. There's not going to be a liability as a result of you saying, hey, you know what? We can't leave them here. We've got to do what we can to get involved in order to make sure that we do the best we can to make sure somebody's safe.
Great. Well, thank you, Sergeant Richards. That's a very important piece of information for us to know. And this is really just because, overdoses happen and we may see one, and, we have an obligation to try to keep others safe. So if we can, we try to help, and we know that we're protected when we do.
Yes.
Well, we're coming up on the closing minutes of our session today. So I just wanted to end our discussion with a few words. Thank you so much to our inspiring and amazing panelists for bringing all of your knowledge today. Thanks to the students for submitting insightful questions. The panel wouldn't have been what it was if we didn't have your questions to work from. We have a few resources available to you. This slide deck here, we've got some DCSA resources for youth as well. Please keep in mind that any questions we didn't get to today, we will be following up with the document, answering those questions just so that you have all of the answers that you need. So thanks to everyone. We appreciate your time. Have a great day. Here are some numbers in case you need any support. As I said, if you're leaving today's session feeling any anxiety or if you're feeling uncomfortable, you can use these lines to get the support you need if you want to have someone to talk to you. So thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful holiday season.
Great, thank you.